Thank you all for joining the session, joining this virtual meetup. And as you can see with me here today, we've got three other people. We've got Maarten Bongers from Time Series, we've got Ron van Arendonk from Time Series, and Dirk van Veen from the S Unit. And you know, as you've guessed by the topic, this is all about security. And if you joined the session thinking you were going to get access to the dark mode of the Mendix Studio Pro, then I'm afraid I'm going to have to disappoint you. We're going to be talking about the dark side of the platform, looking at security and how hackers look at Mendix and might find vulnerabilities in the apps that you build. So I'm really excited about this. Let us know in the chat what you think, and I'll hand it over to Maarten to tell us more.
Yes, thank you, Jan, and welcome to you all. I will be sharing my screen now. Hopefully you can all see.
Yep.
No, that's the wrong one. Present. Okay, so for those of you who don't know me, my name is Maarten Bongers. I'm a Mendix consultant and MVP at Time Series, and tonight I will be your meetup host. And alongside me, you will hear Dirk van Veen, who is a senior security consultant and partner at the S Unit, and my colleague Ron van Arendonk. He's an architect at Time Series. And what are they going to talk about? Well, Jan already said a little bit. We're going to talk about hacking, security, and the Mendix platform. And while I was looking for subjects for this meetup, I found myself a little bit influenced by a podcast I've been listening to called the Darknet Diaries. And if you don't know it, you should probably listen to it. It's about hacking stories told by the host Jack Resider. And there are lots of interesting hacking stories about penetration testing on application, but also, for example, about physical penetration testing of buildings and stuff like that. Very interesting. And when I was listening to this, I was wondering, in our Mendix world, what are stories? Are there stories like this as well? And how do hackers look at Mendix applications? So therefore, I thought let's do a meetup about this, and that's what we're going to do. So the agenda for tonight, first off, Dirk is going to tell a little bit about his experience, because he's working at the S Unit, and the S Unit is responsible for penetration testing at Mendix. So lots of interesting stories there. And after that, my colleague Ron will take over and tell you and even show you some common vulnerabilities through App Store content, which of course is also very interesting to see. And around 8, maybe a little bit later, we're gonna wrap up. One thing to take notice is that during the presentations, you can ask questions in the QA, and after each presentation, we take a little bit of time to answer some of these questions. And I think you can also upvote the questions if you think it's a good question. So then they're gonna go up higher in the list, and we'll be sure to ask them. So on that note, I will give the word to Dirk. I will start off this awesome meetup.
All right, thank you, Maarten. I will be sharing my screen as well. Let's see. Like this. So I see I have a time slot for 25 minutes. I'm used to giving Mendix security trainings, and the trainings usually last at least half a day. So I'm going to try to compress a lot of information into a small space. I will make some assumptions, but let's start at the beginning. So first of all, who am I? Well, my name is Dirk van Veen, in some circles also known as Persik. I'm co-founder of the S Unit, like Maarten mentioned. I've been doing penetration testing since approximately 2011, and I break all kinds of things, web applications, mobile applications, anything you like. But when we look specifically at Mendix, and first time I saw Mendix was in 2015, we had our first client that was building on Mendix. This also led to our first responsible disclosures to Mendix from 2002 to 16. We got quite a good connection with Mendix, and they were so tired of us coming to them out of from ourselves that they said, okay, why don't we just start hiring you? And ever since 2016, we've now been pen testing also for Mendix as a client. So throughout the years, we've been finding bugs in, well, pretty much every component that there is, from Sprinter, App Store, to the runtime itself. And I will be sharing some of the things that we've been finding in Mendix, whether it's for Mendix as our client or for other clients that build on the Mendix platform. And I saw that the talk was called the Dark Secrets. So let's start with the dark not so secrets, because actually most of the information about security in Mendix is public information. If you read the documentation, it's very explicitly says, if you want to have full security, you have to be very explicit in what kind of access you give to forms, entities, microflows, and everything. It says so in the documentation, people forget it. It's not a secret, but it is important. Something that's not in the documentation is that Mendix will allow you to do whatever you want. So if you accidentally try to shoot yourself in the foot, you will succeed. And people are not always conscious of whether they are trying to shoot themselves in the foot or whether they're holding a gun at all. But it's a powerful platform. And like Jan likes to say, with great power comes great responsibility. So I want to touch upon a few things. First of all, I want to tell you about how I, as a hacker, view Mendix apps. Then we'll have some time for some fun stories or horror stories, or depending on your point of view. And I'm going to do some demos throughout, and I hope I can keep this to 25 minutes. So when we talk about Mendix applications, then as a developer, you're very used to seeing this screen. So this is Studio Pro, it's the latest version, and you're building your application and you're trying to go from some abstract model like this to something pretty like this. And you're using Mendix because you like to develop fast and you don't want to delve too much into code yourself. But this also means something for the developers as a group. Usually, they really focus on user stories, user experience, and not so much on technicalities. They often have no traditional programming background. I see a lot of people coming from business backgrounds or user experience. And that makes them very naive when you talk about security. So there's a lot of false assumptions with respect to security that are placed on the framework. There's a lot of reasoning from intended app usage when they think about security and implementing security measures. And they often implement security measures with the idea that if security measure works, then it's good enough. And they don't. They usually don't think about, if I have a security measure, how could it possibly be bypassed? So what developers often think about when they're developing is, I'm building something, I'm building a gate, and my gate is pretty, but they tend to forget that the gate is part of a bigger picture. And there's, gates are not always as useful as you think they are. Now, that's developers. So if we go back to how I, as a hacker, look at an application, this is a finished Mendix product. And the moment that I see this, I don't see this. I ignore everything I see here, because where I live in HTTP traffic. So user interface is nice, but in the end, it's a web server. It's a server-side component that accepts messages and it interacts based on my messages. And for me, it's basically a web application. So I try to look at it abstractly as a web application. I try to inspect the traffic. I try to make a nice overview of what's available in the web application. And This is where Mendix starts to deviate a bit from traditional web applications, because traditional web applications, they have pages or specific APIs that accept commonly used parameters, types, content types, and Mendix has a very specific framework, mostly around the /access endpoint, but it's still basically a web application, and you get to interact with it like a web application, and you get to attack it like a web application without being encumbered by a user interface. So what do hackers see, or how do hackers think about your application? They think there's a big pool of entities with attributes. There's a big pool of microflows, and those are all things that I may interact with through server APIs, because those are offered by the /access endpoint. And things that are offered as basic CRUD, so create, read, update, delete operations. You have search operations on data. You have things to get metadata. You have get session data, which gives a whole lot of information about the domain model of your application. You got metamodel.json, which gives a lot of information about the available microflows. And of course, you have the ability to call microflows directly. Now, for those who don't like to work through HTTP traffic, there's also a very nice JavaScript API, which is documented. So if you don't have Burp, which you just saw in my screenshots, but you do have a browser, you still have a direct access to most of the functionality. Now, this is approximately 90% of all functionality, but there is also another 10% which often gets forgotten, which is that you can extend the Mendix framework using Java. You can create Java request handlers, you can create Java actions, any kind of magic that Mendix does not offer out of the box, you can build it yourself. And a lot of people do. And a lot of people do it in such a way that they introduce more traditional web application vulnerabilities. So as a hacker, if I'm looking at the attack surface, then basically the majority falls within the following categories, like insecure access controls on entities and attributes, insecure access controls on microflows, microflows with insecure functionality, insecure Java, and insecure usage of App Store components. And I think that the last bit is something that Rom will also go into later. But this is pretty much, I think, 95% of all the things that we find. And they seem very trivial. But to a developer who's not used to thinking about security, they are very invisible. So yeah, the top three are the top 80% of these subjects. So let's do a little bit of a demo. You just saw screenshots. What I did today is I downloaded and created a new app on a new account. Here in the studio, I made a new account, hacker@timeseries.bigbadhacker.com, and I just created the first application that was suggested by Sprinter, which is the Studio Tour. Now, if we take a look at the Studio Tour, first of all, let me introduce, this is Burp. This is my local proxy that intercepts all of the web traffic that is sent by this browser. So if we load this, then we will see a lot of traffic going to Studio Tour on in the Mendix cloud, and we will see some things like the get session data that I just mentioned, where if you start looking at object type, then you will see all kinds of different types of entities that are available within this application. And somewhere we have the meta model, where we can see all of the names of the microflows that are accessible through this application. Now, I downloaded this model and I just uploaded it. I didn't change anything. because I was wondering, okay, how secure is the default tutorial application? It is interesting. So this is our application. As it's still in development, you have the whole nice user switcher thing here. So currently we are authenticated as a user, it seems. We do not have access to the management functionality, because we have a management event button which allows us to do some editing. If I am a normal user, I have no such thing. And if I use the so if I try to log out, then I should become an anonymous user, and I still don't have any access to the management things. Now, this suggests that this should be read-only, right? Let's see what has been happening here. So we know from here that there is somebody called Dirk Roos and Johan den Haan. Let's search for Dirk Roos. And here I will make this a little bit bigger, or at least I will try. So this is the object. It's a session object with a speaker called Dirk Roos. It is something with the GUID over here. So let's see if something, if you notice something. Because if we look at this object, then you will see attributes, name, title, has contents. You will see that some of these have a read-only attribute. Now, the read-only attributes are read-only. Guess what that says about the attributes that do not say read-only? Yep, they are not read-only. So I suspect that we should be able to change this through direct interaction. Now, I'm going to use the Mendix API, the JavaScript API. Oh, excuse me. I'm going to use the API, and I'm going to make it a little bit easier to see. I'm going to, because the JavaScript API uses a lot of callbacks, which means that if I start coding here, things can get very obscure very quick. I'm just going to create a callback function that stores whatever in a variable called O. And I am now going to use this to ask the client API to get something with a GUID that ends in 897, which is the GUID that we just found over here. So, and then we're just going to pass whatever comes from here to the output. So by now we should have something in O, and we see that that's correct. So we have an object, and if we look at the object, we see here this is our Dirk Roos. Well, so far we haven't learned anything new because we could already see it on the screen. But what happens if we tell to change the name from Dirk Roos to Dirk van Veen? Ooh. Now, at this point, if I were to refresh the screen, nothing would happen yet because my change is not necessarily committed. However, if I say I would like to commit my object, hit enter, then I can now refresh the page. And if everything goes okay, Dirk van Veen should still be a speaker. There, Dirk van Veen is still a speaker. So this is a very simple example of how, even though the user interface gives no indication that you might be able to manipulate data or maybe to see some data, the model behind it imposes no such restrictions on me as an attacker. So this is a very clear example of the insecure access controls. And you can actually see this because when you go to the security and you look at the XPath constraints, then you will see that the sessions are the full read access, limited write access for administrator, user, and anonymous, no XPath constraints. And this basically goes for almost all of the objects. So you as a hacker, even when you're an anonymous user, you have a lot of control and insight into the data of the application. So let's go back to here and do some fun stories. I also prepared some more demos, but I don't think I will get to those, but we'll see. So story time.
Let's do it by popular demand, right?
But
we'll see.
Okay. So story time. I was doubting whether I would name names during my stories, but I won't. These stories are a collection of things that I found in Mendix or other of our clients. These are real examples, so let's start. First thing, we encountered a change password feature. Now, change password feature, like it was implemented in a microflow. A microflow needs inputs, inputs need objects. So there was an input entity which contained a new password and confirmation password. This input entity was defined as a persistent entity. This means it gets stored in the database. It means it might be retrievable in the future. The password attributes were all defined as strings, so they were nice and legible, and everything was read and writable by anonymous. This means that read and writable without any XPath constraints. This means that if you use the application and if you ever changed your password, your new password was publicly available in the database for everyone to see in plain text. I think this was 2015, so I hope the developers don't do this anymore. But we have another one, another change password feature, which also used an input entity for the new and confirmation password. But it also had attributes for an association with the user object. We checked for insecure read or write access, none of that. There were nice XPath constraints and everything. We could not read other users' things. We could not edit things. We could not edit our association because the association was set by a microflow that create password input, and that got past a user parameter. This got past a user parameter, and it was accessible by users. So not only that, but other user objects were visible to regular users. So you could not see everything of other users. You could just see, I think, their email address, but you could see other user objects. You could call the create password input microflow. So you could call this microflow to create password inputs that were linked to other users, change, specify the new and confirmation password, and you could just say, Mr. Victim, I have now reset your password. You are now mine. More fun stories. I have a theme about authentication. Not everything is authentication, but there is a lot of authentication because authentication is one of the more fun subjects and more of the generic subjects that you can find in almost every application. So we had an application that had a sign-up feature. You as an anonymous user could register, and this means we once again had input entities. This time, persistent input entity for the new user's email, and this was fully readable by anonymous, the input entity. However, there was an XPath constraint. So if you are an anonymous user and you're registering, you could only see the input entity related to your session. However, they also use the input entity to store the confirmation token that is generated and which is usually sent using email. So all you had to do is you started your registration. You said send the email, and then you ask the Mendix API, okay, can I have my input object back and please tell me the token? and you could register without ever having access to the email address. So you can register and confirm arbitrary email addresses. And the fun thing about this client is that the application gave more or less rights depending on your email address domain. So we could register the unit at client.tld, and we had access to everything as the client. Very similar, not a sign-up feature, but an invitation feature. So this feature, you could not start this process yourself, but you could get invited and then, as a manner of speaking, finish the process. So there were persistent entities for invited users, which contained the email and the token. And this persistent entity was also used to store your user data when you click the link and you start to enter your information. So once again, there were XPath constraints, so we could not use this to read other users, but it was fully readable and fully writable. So this means that we could change our email address after we click the link. So once again, we could create an account with an arbitrary email address as long as we could somehow arrange for one of our email addresses to be invited. More stories. This was a fun one that I like to include. This was an export feature. This was a client, and they did a lot of things with the data, and they didn't want to store the data all on-premise. They wanted to integrate with S3 for storage of all the data exports. So you could start a data export. In the background, it would send a lot of data to S3, and after a while, your S3 link would be available. Now, S3 does authentication, and so there had to be a way to generate signed S3 links. They implemented this using a custom Java request handler. So what this request handler did is it, if you called it with a GUID, then it would look for the data export associated with the GUID and generate a signed URL, and then perform a 302 redirect or 303 redirect. So your browser would go to S3 and download the data export with the signed URL. Sadly, the way it retrieved the export data was using retrieve XPath query. And retrieve XPath query allows strings as XPath queries, and they just put our GUID in there, and they didn't do any additional encoding or whatever. And this URL, it assumed that GUIDs are sufficiently random that they function as an authentication mechanism, so there was no other authentication. So this means that we can use XPath injection. So all we had to do is we sent a GUID, which was something like 1 apostrophe or 1 is 1. And that would pretty much allow us to generate S3 for all of the valid URLs for all the exported data on S3. And we could do this as an anonymous user, don't have to be authenticated or anything. So I'm going to do one more story, and it nicely coincides with Rom's subject, which is password forgot. I like password forgot, mainly because it's been broken a lot of times. But this is a story about a client of ours who had an external developer, a third-party developer of Mendix applications. They specialized in Mendix applications. And this third-party developer, they had created their own set of default modules, a framework in which they used to build all of their applications. Okay, that's no problem. This framework, however, it used password forget for password resets. In itself, not that bad. But like I said, password forgot, it got broken several times in the past 5 years. And I think it's up to version 3 point something right now. But this third-party developer, they created the framework many years ago, and they had previously no processing check that periodically updates or applies updates on modules in their default framework. This means that all of the applications that were developed by this third party were vulnerable to account takeover. We accidentally found it in the application that we were testing. We submitted it to our client informed their third party, and that third party, they exploded and they went into full DEFCON 0. And this is a very clear example of the bullet that I said about insecure usage or usage of insecure App Store modules. This also means, and that's something that's a bit difficult with Mendix at the moment, that lifecycle management is something that you have to take into account when you're developing applications. So I'm going to ask to which extent we still have time for additional demos, because I have a few authentication related demos that I can show you just to show you how easy some of these are to implement. If I don't have time, that's okay. I have one last thing to say. So I'm going to ask Jan or Maarten.
What do you think, Maarten?
Yeah,
how long are the demos, Dirk?
Please let him do at least one demo.
Yeah, for sure.
Because
for sure.
I am dying to know what he'll be presenting.
Okay, then
all right.
What I can do is I'm going to present to you the most difficult one, the most complex one, which is also the most
only
fun
45
one.
minutes.
No, it'll just take a few minutes. And I will tell you about the others. Actually, I'm going to do two. So, or I'll just show them all, and I'm going very fast through them because they kind of build on each other. So what I'm going to do, what I've got, I have 4 realistic challenges, each running on a different port. And I have, so we have 0. And I can just tell you what's wrong with them. So realistic 0 is, where is realistic 0? Why is realistic 0 not popping up? I'm hearing beep on my thing, but nothing's happening. Oh, then we'll just go to realistic 1. So this all revolves around the forgot password module, and some of the mistakes are actual password forgot mistakes, others are ported from other applications. But basically, in number 1, the guest user has full read and limited write on all of the attributes of the password forgot entity, which means that if you go to this page and you ask, let's just do this very quickly. If you ask Mendix for all of the forgot password things, Mendix will just tell you, all right, these are all the password forgot things I have, including the forgot password reset link. Which you can just, hello, which you should be able to.
Looks like it's copying the quotes as well.
I'm not seeing anything being copied, but so why is it refusing to copy anything?
Your hacks don't work anymore, Dirk.
My hacks don't work anymore. Oh, I'm so bad. But basically, you can use this link. It's still not copying. Oh, I'm an idiot. Sorry, I'm an idiot. I have to.
Oh, you were
switch.
editing.
No, I am.
Oh.
Oh, and now realistic one died, but that's okay because we have the same. Why did everything is dying right now?
It's the demo effect.
Yeah. So we just started one, which should be. And it's not on local host, but that's okay. Just do a few here. Just as easy. So on 0, we could just ask it for the links whenever we like. In realistic 1, there was an XPath constraint which restricts it to the current user. So you have to start the forgot password before you can do this. And now this will work. So, ta-da! In so now we have changed the password, and we should be able to log in. Yep. 2 is trickier because when you go to 2, you don't see anything here at all. So, however, this looks better. If we look at it from here and we go to burp, you will see if this is 2, this is 2. You will see that there are a lot of forgot password references. So what they did here, or what I did here, and this is actually from one of our clients, is that they used to use the forgot password, but they didn't want anybody to sign up. So what they did is they removed the buttons that said sign up and forgot password from their page. This does not mean they are actually gone, and they did not change any of the access controls. So what you could just do is say, hey, I would like to run the show sign up page. And you could sign up as you wished. And then you could do the whole thing with retrieving of the confirmation token because they didn't change anything else. Now, 83 is special because if we go to realistic 3, and we look at the security, hello. Anti-access. You will see in the XPath constraints, okay, only the current anonymous user can view this. And if we look at all of the rights, am I looking? I'm not looking at 3. Aha. So I was thinking this is not good. So why is everything making beeping noises? In 3, they removed access to the GUID. So we don't have read access anymore. I'm just going to kill it for now. So we do not have read access to the GUID, so we cannot steal the GUIDs anymore. We cannot steal the links. However, what we do have is we have access to access to the email address, and we can write the email address. So what we can do here is we can do the scenario which I mentioned, where you send an email to a valid, oh yeah. Where you can send an email to participant A and then use it to register as participant B. So now we should be able to see the better. So like I said, the forgot password GUID, forgot password URL, they are gone, but the email address is still there. So we are going to cheat right now because we don't have access to, there's no email integration in this one. So in one, we are going to log in as the administrator so we can find valid things. So suppose now I do or how could we should be seeing a open request here, and so we should be able to use this one to validate. And at this moment, if I were to go here, I could, so this is our anonymous user. Usually I would use this to edit my password, but before I do that, I am going to ask the API for my forgot password thing, change my email address, and this is going to go bad. We'll just say so, and we're going to commit it. And now if we go here and we say I should be able to log in. Ta-da! And
awesome.
Many of the vulnerabilities that we find are in this field, are about incorrect attribute access rules, access controls. So I showed you 4 realistic scenarios around password forgot. Some were real, some were ported from other applications. If you want to try this yourself, I made a tutorial application for Mendix World a long time ago. You can find it on this URL. It has links to documentation for the JavaScript API if you like to learn a little bit, play with it, and have fun. And I got slightly over time. I'm sorry.
No problem. I think it was a very good learning experience. And I'm sure everyone's like, I want to see more. But let's get to the questions. We already have a couple of questions coming in.
I'll just stop my screen sharing for now. So
we had one question from someone who said, "This is great, but when are we actually getting the dark mode version of the modeler?" We don't know. So when we do know, you'll be the first to hear. So yeah, Martin, do we have any other questions?
Yeah, so we've got one from Bas de Bakker. It says, any suggestions on how to prevent non-technical developers making mistakes like you showed?
So it is okay if you have non-technical developers developing your application, but there should be a QA process where an actual developer or a security conscious developer checks whether the security requirements of your application are properly implemented and properly enforced by the application. So there is no silver bullet to make uninitiated people make safe applications.
I would like to weigh in on this as well. Years ago, I was developing an application with very high security requirements. And we were a team of 3 developers, and everybody knew the ins and outs of entity access. And I started auditing our security once a month, and each and every month, I found new defects that were committed by a team of 3 experienced developers who knew how to do it and who knew how important it was. It is so detail-oriented. Even as an experienced developer, you are going to make mistakes, and the only way to counteract that is to do regular inspections.
Okay, thank you, Ron, for weighing in on that. We're going to do one more question, and then we're going to go to Rom's presentation. Didn't get the most votes, but I think it's an interesting question. If you're able to see in an easy overview per user role what information they can see per entity in their role, and everything seems to be set correct, to what extent are you able to still hack, retrieve, commit information around this correctly set user role security, and what are the usual flawed parts?
Okay, so if it's a fun precondition here. So the precondition here is if everything is set up correctly, what can go wrong?
Exactly.
And so that means I'm going to cheat here. So this very specifically says if you have an overview of what you can see, which I will interpret as what you are allowed to see. So I'm going to assume that your access rules on your domain model and your access rules on your microflows are implemented 100% correctly. What you often see is that people, when they create Mendix applications, they will use microflows as a tool to implement privileged operations, which is a very good approach in my opinion. So you disallow a lot of write access to things like associations, and you only allow them to be set through controlled microflows. What you see is that a lot of those microflows forget to implement object level access controls. So like I said, with the microflow that was used to create password forget input objects, which accepted a user object, that microflow, the choice to make it dynamic and allow objects to be sent is defendable, if and only if the microflow itself checks whether the user who is currently logged in is authorized to change the password of the specifically specified user. And that's something that is skipped many, many, many times. So, and that's something that we see a lot. So I would say that the dangerously implemented microflows would be the next go-to for me to break your application.
Okay, thank you.
I would have a different answer. If you set everything correctly, you will still have write access to attributes. Now, if you have an application which has very high integrity constraints, so once data has been committed, it can't change anymore, and you do all of your validations in microflows, which you call before you actually commit an object, as Dirk showed, you can simply commit an object through the client API. And so you can remove or change values that you have legitimate write access to and then committed skipping your microflow validations.
Right.
Unless the microflows are implemented as event handlers.
If you implement the microflows as event handlers, that would counteract this, yes. In my opinion, that has maintainability disadvantages, but it is one of the ways to counteract this, yes.
Thank you, Ron.
So we have a lot more questions coming in, guys, but we have to get to the next one. Maybe if people want to stick around after Rom's presentation, we can do a Q&A into, until everyone's tired of it. But I think it's time for Rom to take the stage.
Right, so we're not going to make 8 o'clock, guys.
We're going to make it and more.
And more, indeed. Right, so I'm trying to share my screen.
Yep. All right,
Okay.
we're seeing it.
Excellent. So